Glam Girls, welcome back to my channel. It's Chelsea, where we talk about all things glam and all things girly. I am a beauty enthusiast who loves all things makeup, but I also like to do a little vlogs and some product comparisons and reviews and some fashion hauls. So if those types of videos excite you and really interest you, I would love for you to consider subscribing and joining the Glam Girl Squad. And today, we're doing a review, but we're also doing a comparison of the new NATASHA DENONA Retro Palette to the NATASHA DENONA Lila palette. Now, you might not have thought that there were some comparisons between these two, and you might have. But did you know there are the same shades in both of these palettes? Maybe you didn't know. So today we're going to be talking about those eyeshadows. We're also going to be, of course, creating these eye looks. I have retro on this side and Lila on this side. And we're going to see, is it worth you having both? Or should you just pick one? We'll find out at the end of the video. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I truly do appreciate it. And let's get right into this video. So like I said, we have NATASHA's new midi palette. This is the retro palette. And if you are familiar with any of her eyeshadows, she did release last year the mini retro palette. Now, if you were like me, you were like, wait a second. If this is mini retro, they don't look the same. I was pleasantly surprised to find out that she is supposed to come out with another eyeshadow palette closer to the holidays that's gonna have more of these greens in it. So I was like, okay, because I'm here for this color story, but I just couldn't I couldn't see midi retro and mini retro. So midi retro does retail for the standard $65. It is going to be composed of her pressed pigments. We have metallic shadows in here, shimmer shadows, and then her creamy matte formula. And let me just say, if y'all know me, y'all already know I'm here for this color story. It's beautiful. I've got my fall attire going on. I'm ready. I'm ready for this palette and everything it's gonna bring. So quick swatches of the retro palette. We have Glitz, Andy, Jude, Maud, Vivian, Groove, Apart, Psychedelic, Go-Go, Patty, Nude Mauve, Rebellion, Helio, and last but not least, Amara. Okay, so here are swatches of the entire palette. And like I said, I love this color story. I am here for it. Sorry if the swatches are kind of all over every crevice of my arm, but I wanted to get them all on there. So beautiful color story. And in terms of how they swatch, I think each one of the shadows did swatch quite beautifully. The creamy mattes feel really nice and creamy. They don't feel rough or anything like that. You know, sometimes like in previous palettes, the shimmers are full pigments. In terms of the formula, just right off the back, I do feel like this is one of her better formulated palettes. So I was looking through my NATASHA palettes because I was like, you know, we gotta compare. And I pulled out Lila, and at first I was gonna compare it to Love. And then I pulled out Lila and I realized we have 3 repeat shades in retro that are in Lila. Did you know that? I didn't know that until I looked at it. So the first shade that is in retro, that's also in Lila, is Nude Mauve, this shade right here. So I'm gonna do swatches of both. Here is Nude Mauve in Lila, just so we can see if the formulation is the same and if the pigmentation is the same. And just so you know, I did recently get Lila, probably got Lila about a month and a half ago, so my palette is not old. I didn't get it when it first released. Okay, so here is Nude Mauve in Mini Retro, and here is Nude Mauve in Lila. Are we seeing any differences? In my opinion, there really isn't too much of a difference. If I were being just like really picky, I would say maybe Nude Mauve in Retro is slightly, like ever so slightly deeper. than Lila, but I mean, for the most part, they're basically the same. Next, we have Amara. So here is Amara in Retro, and here is Amara in Lila. Retro, Lila. And I do see a slight difference in pigmentation with Retro's Amara and Lila's Amara. I did go over this swatch again because I felt like it was a little light the first time, whereas this one came out with a little bit more full pigment. And it could be my swatch, who knows? But I also feel like these two had different pigmentations on the eye. You tell me when we get there. And then the last shade that is the same in Retro as in Lila is going to be Helio. And here's Helio in Lila. So Retro, Lila. Any notice in difference with those two? And once again, I do think that Retro's Helio looks a little different than Lila's. And I also feel like there's a difference on the eye. So although the names of these shadows are the same, and basically the shadows are the same, I do think that there's a difference once we see them in action on the eye. So let's get into the demonstration. So I started out with Nude Mauve in Retro and blended that all over. I think that that shade blended out really nicely, no complications, very smooth, very effortless. Like I said, no complications with it. And I did decide to just so that you know, I did go in and use the same brush for the same shades on both eyes. I just did a little color swatch in between both of the eyes, just so you know, so we have a little bit of consistency between the eye looks. Then I went into a Nude Mauve from Lila, blended that in. I felt like the shadows from Lila were, if I could say, a little more silky. And I wonder if it's because in the Retro palette, Natasha did use a pressed pigment formulation, whereas I don't believe Lila has a pressed pigment formulation. So I feel like the shadows from Lila were a little silkier, almost like thinner in their pigmentation. And it doesn't make sense because I don't want it to make it seem like they were less pigmented. It's just like, I don't know, the pressed pigment formulation, if I could like hold them, I feel like the pressed pigment formulation would be heavier than the formulation of the matte shades in Lila. That's the best way that I could describe in terms of like how I felt they blended on the eye. Going in with Amara, because that's what I went in with next, same thing. Amara, I felt like with the Retro, we had a lot more pigmentation kind of all over the eye, obviously using the same brush. And when I went over to Lila, I felt like the shadow was just like, I don't know, silkier in terms of the blend. Both sides blended fine. It wasn't like it wasn't like the Retro side was harder to blend over Lila. It was just a different experience with the blend. I could tell that the formulation of the matte and Retro were different than Lila. And like I said, I think it comes down to that pressed pigment formulation. So after that, I wanted to go in with shades that were similar between the two. So I chose the shade Apart that's in Retro and packed that on the outer edge of the eye. That shade is a creamy matte formula and it seemed to pack on and build up very nicely. I do, like I said, it is definitely a shade that you want to build up. And for me, I've learned the best way to apply Natasha's creamy matte formula, work in small sections, build it up, and that way you'll get the pigmentation that you want, and you can avoid maybe some patchiness that might come with trying to put too much on your brush at one time and then building up the pigmentation from there. So then on the Lila side, I went in with the shade Layla because I felt like that shade looked the most similar in terms of color, and did the same thing, packed that on the outer edge of the eye. Layla is going to be more of like a shimmer formula, so we do see a little bit more sheen from that formula and from that shade compared to the shade, what was it, Apart on the Retro side, but still built up really nicely and still was able to get some depth in that outer corner. So after that, I went in with the shade Rebellion, another creamy matte from Retro, and I put that on the kind of outer edge of a part going toward the middle of the eye. And this creamy matte, granted, I only use a small amount, so I'm gonna have to play with it in a larger amount to really confirm this. But I do feel like this creamy matte would be a little harder to work with, once again, if you're trying to go in with a larger amount. So going in with like a small amount and building it up, I felt like I was able to get the depth that I wanted. But I also noticed on the inner corner of the eye when I was creating my halo, initially wasn't as opaque as it looks in the pan upon initial application. Once again, I was using a smaller brush, so taking in those factors that might have affected it, but I do feel like this is one of those, if I could say, traditional creamy mattes that might be a little challenging to use if you're not familiar with her formula. And I have definitely heard that purple base shades, plum shades are a lot harder to create with the pigmentation that you want without having some challenge with applying them. So that might be it. But I definitely knew, like, okay, and I saw and I experienced needing to work with a small amount and building from there to get the pigmentation that I wanted. But I was able to get there, and I feel like it looks really nice and beautiful. For the Lila palette, I went in with the shade called Pure, and this shade is a shimmer shade, whereas Rebellion is a creamy matte. So we do see more shimmer here, but that shade blended out really nicely, had no complications with it, beautiful shimmer formula. And that's where we kind of start seeing the differences in the eye look, but I do think that shade is really pretty and was able to do what it needed to do in terms of trying to mimic this eye and the tone of what we were trying to go for. So for the halo, I went in with Helio. That is the same shade in both of the palettes. And like I said, I felt like there was a slight difference in Helio on retro side compared to Lila. And it might be due to the shades on the outer edge of the eye not being identical to the shades on the retro side. But I feel like I get more pigmentation of the shade from retro than I do Lila. You guys tell me. For the lower lash line on this eye, I went in with the shade called Groove, and I concentrated that on the lower lash line. This is a traditional matte formula, not her creamy matte formula. And then on this side, did not have a matte shade that was similar to this color of Groove. So I went in with this shade called Viola, and it's a shimmer. Definitely not a different, not the same shade, not the same formula, but I think we were able to create a similar vibe on this side and the lower lash line. And then I blended out both of those shades with Amara from both palettes. Then for the inner corner, on retro side, I went in with a shade called Glitz, and this is one of her more metallic formulas, and it looks really beautiful. Next time I wear Glitz, I'm definitely gonna apply Pat's Intensifies Artistry Wand to really adhere that pigment and get a little bit more intensity from it. On the Lila side, for the inner corner highlight, I went in with the shade Juno, and I love that icy shade. I actually applied it a little bit as a highlight as well, because the highlight that I initially put down was Glitz from Retro, and I felt like it was a little too gold toned. I went in with another highlight thinking that was cooler, and it actually was more gold. So then I finally dipped into Lila and picked the shade Juno, which is what we use for the inner corner, to try to like tone the gold down of the highlight. And it worked a little bit. I should have just went in with Juno from Jump, because that would have been a banging highlight. And then for my eyeliner, I went in with Natasha's new Macro Tech Eye Crayon. This is in the shade Burgundy, and that's what I use for my tight line and my waterline. That's how we created both of these eye looks. So looking at the eye looks, do you think they are similar? I personally feel like they are similar, that if I was standing from afar, you might not be able to tell too much that we were using two different eyeshadows. I think coming up close, you can definitely see those details in terms of the formulation and the pigmentation. But for the most part, we were able to get a very similar eye look on both eyes. And I will admit, I was not expecting that from Lila, because initially looking at Retro, I think you see a lot of those burgundy tones kind of coming at you right off the back. But the more I looked at Retro, I was like, Retro is cooler tone. It's not as warm toned as I initially thought. And then holding it up against Lila and looking at those tones that are the same, I was like, wow, these two palettes they're they're kind of similar. They do have a different vibe, but the tones of both of these stories is quite similar in terms of both of them being more cooler tone. We're pulling on like plums and burgundy over here. We're pulling on purples and magentas over here. And I feel like when you combine the color stories together, we have two palettes that are kind of similar. So here's the question. If I have Lila, do I need retro? And this is what I'm gonna say. I'm gonna say that there's room for both. You probably knew that was coming. Okay, what I mean by there's room for both, because retro is going to pull on more of those burgundies. We don't find those burgundies in Lila. We also don't find this pressed pigment formulation in Lila, which I think is quite beautiful. You just have to know how to work with them. I do feel like this palette is gorgeous. I highly recommend it. It's beautiful. I can't wait to play with it again. And I do feel like I said, this is one of her better formulated eyeshadow palettes. Do I think this is her best formulated midi? I gotta play around with it more. I really want, in order to confirm that, I really need to play with these creamy matte formulas. So we have creamy matte formulas here, 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 and here. And then I want to say that these are going to be the pressed pigment formulation. So I want to play around with those shades more and use them in a larger area of the eye to be able to confirm, is this the best formula of her midi palettes? Right off the back, I want to say no, it's not the best formulated midi palette. I think the better formulated midi palette and still is going to be the bronze. I think that one just all around, the formula is just spot on. So I want to say this is not the best formulated midi, but this is good. Like, this is good and this is gorgeous. This one's good. I highly recommend it. So I do think when we look at retro, we do see a different color story in terms of, if I were to use and pull on more of the burgundies, I'm not gonna get the exact same eye look if I try to like recreate it with this palette, solely focusing on the burgundy shadows. So I do think that there is place for both. Now, in terms of formulation, if you don't want to have pressed pigments in your eyeshadow palette because, you know, those are not safe for the eyes, then go with Lila. Granted, Lila is more money. This palette is $129 versus retro is $65. But if you want like a silkier type of formulation, you want shadows that are just gonna be beautiful and stunning, that work, that are not gonna be challenging at all, then Lila is your bet in terms of between these two palettes. Versus if you feel like, you know what, the color story of retro is more my vibe, you know, I'm fine with working with pressed pigments, I'm okay with the formulation, then I say go with retro. But if you have Lila, I definitely think you can have retro and appreciate both and not feel like you have duplicates, even with the 3 shades that are the same. I was able to create 2 similar eye looks between both palettes, but that was because I was trying to. I felt like, personally, if I were going into Lila to just play with Lila the way that I wanted to, I'm not gonna create this same eye look, you know, and then of course, if I go in with retro, I'm not gonna create this same eye look, and those be basically the only 2 types of eye looks that I create. So I do feel like you can have both, appreciate both, have room for both, and not feel like you've got basically 2 of the same palettes. So I hope that you found this review helpful, and I hope that you're able to figure out which one is better for you if you don't want to have both. But if you do want to have both, you definitely can. So let me know your thoughts down below. What do you think of the eye looks? Are they similar to you? Do you think that these 2 eyeshadow palettes are the same, or do you think they're completely different? Sound off in the comment section. I can't wait to hear from you guys. And if you've made it to this point in the video and you have yet to subscribe to my channel, I would love for you to consider subscribing and joining the Glam Girl Squad. And guys, that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope to see you in my very next video. Bye, guys.